All right, another fun conversation and controversial topic with Dr. Samuel Wilkinson from Yale University. We talk about evolution, and there's going to be a broad spectrum in this audience of, those who don't want to touch evolution with a 10-foot pole, those are looking at, some natural selection, intelligent design, et cetera, et cetera. This conversation assumes at a minimum an intelligent design where there is science that is meeting up with purpose of God and the plan of salvation and the creation. And if that's the case, how might this look to have gospel principles actually produced out of biology and intelligent design or evolution? Now, before we go into this, I want to talk about Cardio Miracle. I have been with Cardio Miracle for, I believe, about a year and a half now, taking their product. I take it religiously 3 times a day. I was just at the doctor again today. Fantastic results. That was not the case before I was on this product. And I can say that not because I feel better, which is true, but actually lab results, right? I can look at the data, the ingredients that you're going to find in Cardio Miracle help produce the nitric oxide and the delivery system that helps you with so many health issues. Go to cwicmedia.com. That's CWIC media.com. Scroll to the bottom, go to the video, watch the testimonial, and find out more about the product. Give it a try. It's a free 90-day trial. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we've brought on Dr. Samuel Wilkinson, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Yale University. He is also the Associate Director at the Yale Depression Research Program. Dr. Wilkinson, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
All right, so you've recently written a book called Purpose. Let me get the full name here. Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. I think it is implied in the title here, kind of what it's about. But will you go into a little bit about what your objective is or was in writing this book?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I decided to write this book a long time ago, 15 years ago, when I was actually a first-year medical student, and when I started medical school, my wife and I had just married. And for whatever reason at this time, I studied engineering as an undergraduate. And so you had to take some biology courses. But for whatever reason at this time, I had this sense that what I was learning in school and science was in conflict with the sense that I had, that most people have, that, life has purpose and value and meaning, and the sense that we were created for a purpose. That seemed to be in conflict in my mind. And I went through this period, several months really, where I was just kind of wrestling with this. And I after a lot of study and reflection and prayer and meditation, I had this just experience, this epiphany where things seemed to come together and at least in my mind, fit together in a beautiful way. And I decided at that point I was going to write a book. I tried to write a little then, and I had to put it on the side while I finished med school and training and started my family. And then I was able to pick it back up a couple of years ago, and it came out in March of 2024. So thrilled I could kind of come this whole process.
Okay. And so do you feel that in writing the book then, you're trying to bring the two together then, right? You're trying to bring science and religion together.
Yeah.
Because it's obvious, right? You've got people on a spectrum where they won't even look at evolution as an option, right? Because for them, they see it. There's been so much talked about with it. It's so driven by a secular, honestly, atheistic point of view and narrative that people are like, they're going to shun it, right? It's like, I don't even want to deal with this. I don't even want to look at it. And many will just be completely anti-evolution and saying that they don't mesh, right? Is your hope a little bit that this is not just a a bridge that you're creating, but maybe you're giving some thought to a way that people can reconcile this for themselves?
Yeah, that's what I hope with the book, is that I can bring these worldviews a little bit closer together.
What would you say is the core battle between evolution and religion?
There's a lot of them, and there are two that I really try to address in this book, and they butt up against others as well. But one is this: there's this perception that evolution was this totally random and haphazard process, right? And if that is the case, then it would be hard to figure out how we could really have purpose. And it seems incongruent with, a God that had a purposeful and intentional act of creation, right? And so that's kind of one issue, right? This notion that evolution was totally random and haphazard and unguided and so forth. The other aspect of it is what evolution, if it is true and is responsible for, our bodies, what it implies about human nature and human psychology. So those are at least two kind of things that for me were really off-putting, and I think it had more to do with my limited understanding of what the science suggests and what it implies about kind of this overall framework.
We'll talk about that a little bit then, though.
Okay.
So you went through in the book and you talk about this randomness and how that is kind of, that's really what Darwin was saying. This is all built on randomness, natural selection. There's but you're writing in the book with the objective, at least for the reader to understand, that evolution is not random.
Yeah.
Or at least if there is randomness in evolution, it is very limited.
Yeah, that's right. So, I think it is a combination of both random and non-random things. Like, for instance, your eye color may be determined by a random reassortment of your parents' genes, but the fact that you have eyes and that they're structured the way that they are, that seems to... There's a lot of non-randomness there, that almost like an inevitability in biological matter that your eye is structured the way it is. So evolutionary theory posits that we have this common ancestor and we each went our separate ways, and over time, through part random but also part environmental necessity, we've kind of fallen into these different structures and ecological niches is one way you could frame it. But when you look at the broader picture, you see that there are these patterns recurring over and over again. So I mentioned eyes. Humans have the same type of eye that a squid or an octopus does, but we each develop them independently. And they, for all intents and purposes, it's the exact same biological structure. And so you think, what is the probability of it happening once randomly? That's, maybe I can believe that. But then it happens twice with the exact same structure. And you're like, there may be something going on here. And, it's not just eyes. Pretty much every biological structure has developed more than once. So you get this sense very quickly that, it's not just one random thing after another. There's a pattern here. And there's a lot we don't know exactly about how nature, or God, if you want to bring that into it, what laws were used to shape these things. Certainly the principle of natural selection, we can get into what that is, plays a big role. But there seem to be kind of constraints or laws that have kind of shifted it to go in one direction and not the other.
And you would attribute that to sort of an intelligent design?
Well, I wouldn't. I don't know exactly. So there's some people who think, okay, there's natural law, right? There are constraints that have kind of guided the mutations to go in one direction and not the other. There are other people who say, well, at some point God kind of put his finger in the primordial soup and kind of nudged it one way. I don't really know whether it's one or the other. Probably a combination. I do think we were designed. In the phrase intelligent design is linked with kind of a group at the Discovery Center, I think is what it's called, based out of Seattle, with Bill Dembski and some other. And they're very, very intelligent people. I mean, I think one of the things that they are, their approach is to say, well, there are these kind of holes in evolution, which there admittedly are, and they're very, very smart people, but they're, in some ways, you might say that they're looking for God in the gaps of our understanding, which one of the tricky things with that is that as science progresses, our understanding, the gaps in our understanding tend to close. So I'm not necessarily trying to fight against evolution.
Well, let me just say something real quick on that, Sam. So I think that at least I don't know that that group is, I've listened to them speak many times and read some stuff from them, but I don't know if that group is pushing off on evolution as much as they are, as you said, they look at Darwinism and say, well, wait a minute, there are some serious gaps, as you said, in Darwinism.
Yeah.
But as a whole, with evolution, they seem to kind of go along with it, don't they? I mean, they're kind of saying there's a form of evolution, natural selection, certainly, but there are problems with the idea that maybe we come from a single cell and that we've developed from a single cell all the way to human beings.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember his name. He writes about the edge of evolution, that evolution does happen, but there are limits to how kind of much structural change you can get from evolution. In some ways, we just need to be really careful about making sure we're using the terms consistently, because in many ways, I do agree with a lot. I certainly don't think it was random. And what you mean when you say Darwinism, we could spend a lot of time unpacking what that means. I believe, and we can get to this, I believe that natural selection has shaped human nature for both better and for worse. I am skeptical also that there was only one single cell. We talk about all these things developing independently. I don't know why there couldn't have been many in original cells or life forms, whatever. I don't necessarily go there. I try to stay with quote accepted mainstream science. Mainstream science does generally think that there was one original cell. I think it's because they haven't really thought about it. That it's just kind of been an assumption that has been passed down since Darwin first published *The Origin of Species* in 1859. For me, it's not that important. That wasn't one of the sticking points of this theory of evolution it doesn't mesh well with me. For some people, I understand admit that may be an issue, but I don't necessarily go there. I don't know how you could look at the broader evidence and say this was totally random, because there are, whether it's natural laws, whether God was putting his finger in the soup, I don't exactly know, but you clearly see that there's a pattern here, and one of the anecdotes in the book is how Richard Dawkins would agree with this, right? Richard Dawkins, he made this point by asking one of his, for those of you Richard Dawkins is probably one of the most outspoken atheists of our generation, a very famous evolutionary biologist, who asked one of his friends, can you think of, quote, good ideas that have evolved only once? And his friend could only think of a handful. So clearly a big part of this is that, eyes are going to be helpful for any creature that, where the properties of light exist. Wings might be helpful for some creatures, that sort of thing. So they've evolved many, many different times. But I also think there's some deeper kind of structures to biology that have kind of pushed it to go in one direction and not the other.
Deeper structures that were put in by God.
Well, yeah. I mean, in our specific doctrine, I think there's a little bit of, to me, it's not clear whether God designed the laws of nature or understood them and mastered them. Mm-hmm. I don't really know. Hopefully one day we'll figure out. But yeah, I mean, I think there was a deity behind this in some way, right?
Okay. So, and somehow he's taking what already, let's just call them, how do we call them? Because this is kind of tricky, but eternal natural laws.
Sure. Yeah, something like
right.
that.
And using that and using it for good.
Uh-huh.
in a sense. Okay. So you talk about how the development of social structures, individuals and social structures are developed through evolution. Well, will you go into that a little bit? In other words, you talk about altruism versus selfishness and how these work. You talk about both a positive and a negative of these.
Yeah. So this principle of natural selection, and maybe another way to use this is with the phrase survival of the fittest. Most people are going to more intuitively understand what that means. And this phrase was not coined by Darwin, but by another biologist around that time. When most people think about survival of the fittest, I think intuitively what they think about are the negative aspects of human nature that might predominate in a, quote, Darwinian paradigm. But over time, biologists and psychologists have recognized that, well, animals and people we're not exclusively selfish. So there's something going on, right? In religion, you have this conundrum of, well, if God is good, why is there evil? And in a Darwinian paradigm, it would kind of flipped it on its head. If survival of the fittest is the ruling paradigm, how come there is good? And there's lots of potential ways that altruism or goodness may have developed. I think the most compelling one has to do with what is called the levels of selection. So this issue, it flips this phrase and says, well, survival of the fittest what? Are we talking about survival of the fittest individual? Or are we talking about a survival of the fittest family or group? And when you think about the different social traits that would emerge from those different levels, they are in many respects in opposition to one another. So let me just, if I can drive this point home with an anecdote. So in 1864, this is an analysis that I borrow from a colleague of mine at Yale, Nicholas Christakis. But in 1864, which is coincidentally the same year that this phrase survival.
He's great, by the way.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of his writing. In 1864, which is the same year that this phrase survival of the fittest was coined, there were two shipwrecks that occurred at the same time and place in what are called the Auckland Islands, about 300 miles south of mainland New Zealand. Now, the first ship was led by a man named Thomas Musgrave, and after about 18 months, fortunately, all of the crew from his shipwreck, his ship, survived. The second ship was led by a man named George Delgarno, and unfortunately, most of the crew from his ship died. And so you think, well, what was the key difference? And the difference was that Musgrave's group formed this remarkably cohesive, social organization. And this was epitomized when Musgrave himself, he carried an injured man on his back, and within the first, minutes of the shipwreck, as he swam to the safety of the shore. And Delgarno's group, they unfortunately kind of adopted this every man for himself approach, and they left a wounded man behind to die within the first few days of shipwrecking as they searched further inland for food. And so you see that, like in some cases, it's going to be altruism and cooperation and so forth that is beneficial to survival and so forth. Does that make sense? Do you see how it's not just selfishness, right?
Right. There would be selfishness. In other words, survival of the fittest. It's kind of like what they do with who is it? Wall that talks about the chimpanzees and their survival and how they work together. And the ones that actually are too selfish, the group comes in and actually kills that chimpanzee.
Yeah.
Whereas if a leader is more open and supportive of the group, then they're going to last longer.
Yeah.
Right. So there are certain things. The question though that comes up then is between these two captains or leaders of these groups, then you're saying that biology has brought in both elements.
Yes.
One is from biology that says, I'm selfish and I'm not going to take care of these men as well. And the other one is I'm going to do what it takes for everybody. And they're going to see that. And these are both driven by evolution. My question though is, doesn't that completely remove free will or agency? Right?
Well,
is the difference the man and his choices, or is the difference that, because it's like you have a quote actually here from a Theodosius Dobzhansky in 1964, who proclaimed nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution.
Yeah.
So in that example, it seems like, well, if it's all looking through evolution, it's both human beings, both similar circumstances, both same environment. If evolution is explaining both sides, it seems to me like it removes the soul, right? It removes choice.
Yeah. I'm not intending to make that argument. What I believe, I'm using the example of the two shipwrecks to show how, in contrary to I think most people intuitively think when they think about evolution, there are ways in which evolution also created cooperation, ability to cooperate, ability to be altruistic, and so forth. I think in our ancient history, both of these levels have played important roles, and they have built within us these competing dispositions, right? It doesn't take long to look through the history of human nature, of humanity, and to see terrible examples of selfishness in which we've treated each other in unspeakably violent and terrible ways. But we can also see, the moral heroes, those who have kind of heeded the quiet stirring of the soul to treat each other kindly, to cooperate and to sacrifice ourselves for the benefit of others. I think this is what I refer to as the dual potential of human nature. And I think that evolution through God is the way that this was put into our bodies. In Scripture we talk about the natural man, but there's also references to how there is goodness within the body, right? You're the temple of God, and so I think we have both capacities built into our flesh, and when you combine that with the experience that we do have, that we have the ability to choose, to me, it seems like life is a test, right? We have this ability to choose, and literally within our DNA, we are pulled in different directions. We have competing desires, and I do believe in free will. Where that comes from, from a secular perspective, I don't know I can give a good answer, or how it develops from infancy to adulthood in a given individual. There's still a lot there, but I think the evidence is compelling from psychology and other fields that we do, within constraints, we do have the ability to choose. And so I think this is paramount to one of the purposes of our existence. I think evolution built our bodies. Probably free will is related to the spirit and soul in some way. I can't tell you the mechanisms, but I think that life is a test, and you can kind of connect the dots, as it were, by connecting a lot of this evolutionary psychology and biology with this notion of free will.
Yeah, because I'll get back to the free will here in a minute, but here's so just because I think this is an interesting concept, right? What you're saying that the development of the human being through evolution, right, is producing both good and bad.
Yeah.
Right. And so far as an example, and you give some of these examples, but one example is, it's evolution is actually creating, helping to create social structures such as family,
yep,
and tribes and other ways that individuals and groups can survive, right, through the you're attributing it to evolution, to saying that evolution is producing these things. And so it's natural to have within us, say, for example, some tribal feelings, because those were things that helped us to survive in the past. And that this is both, you can look at that as both a positive, right? Family's pretty positive.
Yep.
Right. But also it can bring in a negative nature, right, of exclusion, of racism,
outgroup bias. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or any other biases. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sex would be another example, right? If sex is a physical, biological force, in us, then it can be used for good or for bad. So the promiscuity on one end, on the other hand, it's like, okay, there's a restraint and an order of monogamy and producing families and et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. So I extend this to one of the things you sometimes read in the popular press is that it's not in our nature to be monogamous, right? And that has always annoyed me, but I can see that there's some truth in that, but it's not the complete picture, right? We do have that capacity, but we do also have the capacity to be monogamous. And in a very real way, we are pulled in different directions. And there are definitely real sex differences between men and women and sexual desire and so forth. But in a real way, I think we have the capacity for promiscuity, but also the capacity for long-term pair bonding, as using secular language.
Yeah. So another point you made, and you brought this up a couple times about a test. I'm going to take this out as a quote here in the book. It says, as we consider these principles, it would seem that the purpose of our existence, or at least one such purpose, is to choose between these competing natures.
Yeah.
To choose between altruism and selfishness, cooperation and aggression, love and lust. In language that has largely been discarded, a fundamental purpose of our existence is to choose between the good and evil inherent within us. Life is a test. Yeah. So I just think that's a really interesting perspective, again, that just says, look, evolution, if you're going to buy into that and into evolution, you're saying that evolution actually produces one of what we would believe, certainly in Latter-day Saint circles, is one of the primary purposes for us even being here.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of like inherent in the laws of nature, at least it is from my perspective. Which was, I mentioned this experience I had when I was a medical student. I just remember kind of these things coming together, and it was to me, it's beautiful.
Yeah. So, and now you said also in here that you were drawing on a number of different disciplines as you went through. I mean, you're an expert in psychology. How would you see that fitting into all of this a little bit more? I mean, I know we've talked about family structure, different things like that, but you focus in on mental health and depression and issues like that. How would that fit into this structure, this dichotomy that evolution would be producing?
Well, so I focus a lot on depression, and in some ways, I have a lot of this in this book, the book Purpose that we're talking about, of what is it that we find in life that helps give us meaning and purpose and happiness. And a big, the answer that we keep coming back to in psychological science is that relationships are foremost and fundamental, the most important factor in human flourishing and well-being and so forth. What's less clear is where that comes from. Okay. And again, I'm trying to stick to science in a kind of a secular logic here. Mm-hmm. What I am suggesting is that a big part of that comes from the way that nature shaped our psychologies. And, certainly social relationships have always served us well. A lot of it also, I think, comes from the way that nature shaped the parent-child relationship. So this gets into what is called attachment theory. This was largely laid out by a psychiatrist, a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby in the mid 1900s. Bowlby came of age professionally at a time when Freudian theories still held a lot of sway. And there was a sense in the early 1900s that relationships weren't really important. They were just a means to an end. Okay, the infant loved the mother because she gave the infant milk. The man loved the wife because she gave him sex. And very transactional. And Bowlby recognized that didn't really explain the complexity of human interaction, and even really animal interaction. He observed, he formed relationships with those who studied animal behavior and recognized that they had long kind of recognized that relationships in and of themselves. We're something important just for animal behavior. And so Bowlby recognized this interesting aspect of human nature, which is that human infants, when they are born, they are utterly and completely helpless. And we are kind of at one end of the biological spectrum in this regard. So like, a foal, a giraffe can like walk within a few days of being born. But we, human beings, we're utterly dependent on the care of our parents for like the better part of 15 years. And so what Bowlby, he theorized as well, okay, there has to be a strong reciprocal attachment from the part of the parents. There has to be a strong sense of love and care and concern. Otherwise the child would not survive. And that's exactly what happens. Anyone who has had a child can remember, just especially with the first child, this deep sense of love that you have. And I think that is kind of inborn into it, that's built into us by the way that God created us. Okay. And so that, I think that strongest form of love between, parent and child, that has to do with the kind of the root of human happiness and well-being. And it, as Bowlby recognized, and as subsequent, psychologists and psychiatrists recognize, the parent-child interaction forms the basis for all kind of subsequent relationships in life. And if that relationship, that primal relationship is not good, it's unfortunately really hard for that person as they develop in their other social interactions.
So how would you see then, is evolution then a producer of this special relationship we have then because of how we're born and we're so reliant on our parents? Is that all due to evolution?
Well, I mean,
let me just say real quick. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I really appreciate the direction you've gone with on this book, and you're trying to take a what we know from academia, what we know from science, and trying to take a faithful approach and say, this is how I've pulled all this together, and I see all this, and it's beautiful, and so you're focused on that end of it. Yeah. I'm just trying to figure out where is the spirit with this in terms of how do I see that and free will, which I wanted to get to. How do I see that within this developed and God-guided mortality? Yeah.
Well, mostly I don't know. There's just so much we don't know about the spirit because we don't do experiments on it. I think I get what you're saying, and some people could say, well, this is a cynical point of view, right? I only love my kids because they have my genes. Mm-hmm. And I would frame it as, well, that is how God made you. God made you such that you have a deep love for your family. Mm-hmm. And, the evolution in a certain framework is very pro-family, right? So going back to this issue of, the importance of relationships for human happiness and flourishing, if evolution is somehow responsible, at least on some level, for that phenomenon, then I would argue that the most relevant relationships biologically are family ones, are therefore the most important for our happiness and well-being. And that is the way that we are psychologically and evolutionarily engineered. That's how God made us such that our families are of utmost importance in our well-being.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
So the short answer is I don't know. I can't do experiments that test the spirit. There's just a lot that's not open to our understanding. So I therefore stick with kind of what we can grasp and infer from science and secular sources.
No, I actually really appreciate the approach. I mean, because if you whether you, because this audience is going to be on a wide spectrum here as far as their belief in evolution and how much of it in intelligent design and everything else. But I think that if you take the perspective of evolution and say, okay, well, if evolution is the right way that we have come here physically, then then if God guided this in this way with these natural laws, then it's a way for him to provide for us to be who we're supposed to be, right? It's a way for him to show his love and creation, through creation of who we are, and provide everything from the sustenance in creation to the ability to be tested and choose.
Yeah. I like that. And let me just share one aspect that I think is interesting about this. So if you agree with me and you think that evolution, at least in part, is responsible for kind of the way that we've developed, let's go back to this principle of the strong love that develops between parents and child. Okay. You get into this notion of that you have to have opposition, or at least you can't have this deep love without compelling sacrifice, right? So let's say you line up 10 parents and you say, what is the most rewarding thing you've done? 9 out of 10 of them will say, raise my kid. Okay. And if you ask them another question, what's the most challenging thing you've done? 9 out of 10 of them will say, raise my kid. Yeah. Right. And from an evolutionary paradigm, those two are like inseparably connected, right? Let me do like a counterpoint with this. Imagine what life would be like if we were, say, seahorses. Okay, so seahorses obviously are different than us in many ways. One of the ways is that, well, males in seahorse, males get pregnant. So that would obviously there would be some very different parental leave policies probably. The other way that they're different is that once the seahorses are born, like the parents don't look after them. It's just like, okay, goodbye, good luck. I hope you don't get eaten. Pass on the genes, and I hope you survive, right? If no one knows exactly what it'd be like to be a seahorse, but it's a good bet that they don't have a deep kind of sense of love and care and concern for their kids, because they have a different like survival strategy. They have 2,000 kids all at once, and that's enough that some of them eventually survive without the parental care. So, you get this sense that if evolution is responsible for at least the feelings of love we have in the flesh, then you can't have this deep love without this compelling sacrifice, right? It's because our kids are so immature when they're born that we love that. That's related to our deep love for them. So you can't have this really deep, rewarding sense of parenthood without it also being extraordinarily challenging. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it's like at the confluence of biology and psychology, at least, these two things of love and sacrifice are related.
No, that's fascinating. That's pretty cool. Now, going again back to natural selection on this, with the survival of the fittest, this comes out politically with a very stringent libertarian point of view. Live and let live, and do your best based on your own merits, basically, right? Yeah. Very Ayn Rand or Ayn Rand type of a thought, who was atheist. But won't you end up eventually, if everything is moving towards survival of the fittest through natural selection, it's saying, okay, what am I doing against my competitors? Not only my competitors that are also, let's say, prey, but also those that are after me, right? So I am going to get better and better. I'm going to be more camouflaged. I'm going to be faster, because those are the ones that make it. And so those are the ones that are going to be passing on their genes and improving and improving. While on the other side, let's say that you're talking about a gazelle, right? On the other side, you've got the tiger or the lion, let's say the lion that is also going through natural selection, and the ones that are surviving are the fiercest and the strongest and the fastest, and the ones that are able to get the gazelle as well. So it seems like your natural selection through evolution is just producing more and more hyper competitiveness with all of these groups. Where does that lead to? Eventually it's like, is everybody just in an equilibrium as they go through this process? And if that's the case, what is the point of it in the first place?
What is the point of it in the first place? That's an interesting question. I don't think that natural selection is the only thing that has guided evolution. I do think it's a big thing, but I don't think it's the only thing. And this goes back to the findings about how there are these patterns that occur over and over and over again. I think there are these deeper laws that kind of constrain evolution to go in certain directions and not others. I mean, yes, you can look around the natural world and find lots of examples of competition, but you also find examples of cooperation, right? And so say, in our ancient history, there were two tribes that were poised to compete for some resource, access to a river, whatever. Say instead of competing, they chose to cooperate and make an irrigation system. They would have done even better than in a parallel universe, the two same groups that chose to kind of fight it out and so forth. So I think, again, both of these levels, especially in human evolution, have been really important and have led to the development of these kind of warring desires and natures within us. So I mean, the other question is, why, if this is the mechanism by which creation happened, why did God choose this? I don't know. I can't answer that question. Why didn't God just make us all in heaven so we didn't have to go through that? There may be, I think there is this necessity of struggle, right? That's part of the reason that at least we think that we're here. So I can't answer all the questions. These are deep,
come on, Sam,
philosophical questions.
All right, let me go back again then over to finally get over to free will here and talk about that a little bit. You bring up a couple of categories or arguments that fall into these two categories. One is determinism, and I don't know if I haven't even heard this word before, epiphenomenalism. Will you briefly go over those two and talk about how that fits into what you're talking about?
Yeah, so this is from the area where I talk about free will, right? So as you know, as most people know, there are a lot of really smart people who think that free will is just an illusion. And so I lay out my best efforts to kind of show how actually the data from my perspective show that no, free will is a real thing. And the way I do this is these two kind of concepts of determinism and epiphenomenalism are some of the common arguments that free will deniers will use to say, yeah, this is just an illusion. So determinism is essentially that the present and the future are completely determined by the past, right? You have these laws of nature that are in motion and molecules are moving around and nothing can change them. They're just determined beforehand. That everything that we do, including this conversation, was predetermined by, at the time of the Big Bang. All right, the next time that Halley's Comet passes through the inner solar system is as determined as who you will marry, which I think most people intuitively find a little bit absurd, if I can use that strong of language. But as far as we can tell, behavior and even of relatively simple organisms is not deterministic. And I'm fine to categorize it as probabilistic. I think even human behavior can be considered probabilistic. If it weren't that way, then things like policies and laws and so forth wouldn't really have much of an effect. But it's not completely deterministic. So sometimes I think people mistakenly get the sense that we're learning so much more about genetics that we can predict, the time someone was born, what kind of things they're going to choose in their life. And that's just so far from where we are in biology and psychology that it's just a little bit absurd. So I use examples of basic organisms, very, very simple organisms compared to humans, at least, where their behaviors are not deterministic. Okay. Epiphenomenalism is this sense that our thoughts and our perceived choices are just the byproducts of the neural machinery that's going on, right? So most educated people think that the brain and the mind are somehow intimately connected, and things will happen in the brain that cause things to change in the mind, right? If you're intoxicated, you have alcohol permeating your brain, that's going to change how you behave, right? So there's this causation that goes from, you might say, bottom to top, or from the brain to the mind. And epiphenomenalists will say, well, that's the only direction that it can go. Any thoughts you have, they're just the byproducts of these machines and gears turning in your brain. You can't have top-down causation. You can't have your thoughts control your behavior. That's what epiphenomenalism is. And it turns out that there's a lot of literature in psychology where I think that's been shown to be falsified. Where, if you have different groups, say you want, like you have two groups of college students and you're trying to get them to exercise. For one group, you say, well, I really want you to think out the details and plan it out in your mind. And the other group, you just say, well, just exercise. Okay. And when you measure the behaviors, the ones that really think about it more, they're much more likely to exercise. Okay. So I think there's lots of compelling data that our thoughts can also influence our behavior. So the arrow of causation doesn't just go from the brain to the mind. It can also go from the mind to the brain. So the first part, like determinism, that's the free part of free will. And the second part is the will part, that you have top-down causation of behavior. And I think both of those criteria are met, and henceforth that at least humans have free choice.
Well, I don't know anybody that lives their life thinking other than I choose what I choose.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know how that would look if you didn't. I don't know anybody. I mean, even, I listened to like a Sam Harris or someone like that, one of the new atheists, and who does not believe in free will. And it's like, you're not making any of your choices. You don't choose anything. It's all determined by yourselves. It's that's just an odd thing. And I can't imagine in your field, a psychologist, psychoanalyst, sociologist, anybody going through and operating with individuals as if they don't have a choice. Yeah.
I mean, as you mentioned, like Robert Sapolsky just came out with a book. Robert Sapolsky is a famous scientist who's sold lots of books. And he came out with a book about this in the fall, in which he put forth his case why he doesn't think free will is real. But then, when you listen to him, he says, well, I'm the biggest hypocrite, because the only time I don't believe in free will is when I'm having these deep philosophical discussions. The rest of my life, I go around assuming that I'm a free and responsible agent. So, I mean, again, to me, it's fairly intuitive, and most people also intuitively believe that free will is a real thing. It's just these worldviews are, I don't know. I guess the doctrine of determinism is attractive to some people, and it's hard for them to grasp. I think also there's some religious implications, right? If some biologists might say, well, if you have free will, then that means you must have a soul. So therefore, I don't believe in free will. There's another book out by a guy named Kevin Mitchell, who's not a believing scientist, but he makes a very good case for a naturalistic argument for free will. It's a dense book. I think his book is called Free Agents, but it's a really good book for the arguments in the science that suggest that actually we do have free choice.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Dr. Wilkinson, appreciate your time. Is there anything you'd want to finish up with here, just to tell the audience about why they need to read your book?
Well, let me just, if it's all right, let me go back to the family really quickly.
Let's go there.
Because, we mentioned how the framework that I'm trying to lay out here is that, human nature is full of these competing dispositions, right? Selfishness and altruism and so forth. Therefore, my framework, what I'm trying to get across here is that if we can put people in context where they are ensconced in family relationships, they will tend to choose the better angels of their nature, because that is at the root, that is the origin in the flesh, at least, of the strongest forms of love, affection, altruism, trust, loyalty, and so forth. All the kind of good qualities of human nature that we think of. So when you can help people to form and maintain families, and especially to help men be tied to their biological children, they will more likely choose the better aspects of their nature. And I think that's a function of the way that we were created. And this is one of the reasons that I think the family is so critical and marriage is so critical, right? You look at sex differences. There's big sex, a lot of the sex differences psychologically, what scientists think is that they have their root in what is called a difference in, it's a clunky term, it's called obligatory parental investment, which is essentially how much you have to invest in your offspring for them to kind of survive and thrive. And it's very, very different for a man and a woman, right? A woman carries a child for 9 months, and then, in the not too distant past, bottle feeding wasn't a thing. There was breastfeeding for sometimes years. And a man, not to be too crude here, but it's possible for a man to conceive a child and not even know it, right? And so there's this big imbalance in obligatory parental investment in humans. And I think it's important to tie men, you need to have some cultural force that links men to their biological children to kind of offset this difference. And for most of history, that has been one of the purposes of marriage. Now, most people don't think of it, as the, like when I got married, I wasn't like, yeah, I'm going to be tied to my biological children. But that is, I think, look around at lots of different cultures. That is one of the fundamental purposes of marriage. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so important. And the family, the doctrine of the family is so important. It's, the evidence from biology, from psychology, from sociology is that we know it's overwhelming that, marriage and family relationships are good for children, but they're also good for adults. And they're especially good for men. It's very motivating, right? To be in a marriage and say, okay, I am responsible for helping to protect and care for my children. That, there's a lot of problems with boys and men growing up today. And I think we discount how important it is, how motivating a force. When you think about from an evolution perspective, there's nothing that's more motivating than to be providing for your biological offspring. And marriage helps kind of men take on that mindset. So, lots of maybe different aspects of thinking about these really important principles. A lot of your listeners will be familiar with. And I think they're rooted in biology and evolution and psychology and so forth. I think they're rooted in the way that we were created. Does that make sense?
That's great stuff. And that sounds like another interview down the road because I'm very interested in those things. Very, very interested. So anyway, Dr. Wilkinson, thanks again. The book is Purpose, What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. I'll put the link in the description box. And Sam, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Greg, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.